I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. I got into making videos because I wanted to help people learn more about the hobby and get over the learning curve. And there's a pretty big learning curve in this hobby. A lot of times people get stuck, they get frustrated, they can't solve a problem. And I'm going to start a video series where I reach out to help them. This video series, I'm going to be one-on-one helping somebody with a problem, similar to my real-world troubleshooting video that I made a little while back. Well, that was in person with a guy from the local flight club. In this case, I'm reaching out to people over the internet to try and talk them through their problems and hopefully pass along some knowledge along the way so that even if you're not having the exact same problem they're having, you can learn something, pick up little tidbits of knowledge. It turns out that we're not all special, unique individual snowflakes. Many of us are having the same problem, and I know that because many of you reach out to me with your problems, and I'm like, didn't I just answer this one? No, that was somebody else, and that was 3 other people too. So let's get into this series. Well, the first one, I'm going to be helping someone who's having trouble getting his receiver to talk to his flight controller. Once you introduce yourself and the problem you're having, the equipment that you've got, let's just get a sort of a quick overview of what's not working right.
Sure. I have I am totally new to drones. I have a Radiolink AT-10 with an Eachine Wizard, and I got it for Christmas, and it's been in the air probably 2 times.
So what's the transmitter?
It's the Radiolink AT-10. It comes with I see the receiver that I have is it is the R6. Let me just double check. Is the Radiolink 10-channel S Plus receiver. Is the R6 DSM.
Okay.
So I got it to work. I hooked it up. Communicated with my quad. I hooked it up to Betaflight. I inputted your CLI settings. I made some adjustments to the channel mapping. Got it to work. Got it all configured. Took it out. The range wasn't that good because the receiver that I'm using is like this big. So I thought that I would use the R12DS, which is like a double antenna.
Right. It's got diversity. It's a full size receiver. It's a full range receiver.
It's their newest one. Radiolink fails to mention that in order to use their newer stuff with the AT-10, you have to upgrade the firmware on the AT-10. The problem with that is the only way you can upgrade the firmware is through a Windows XP machine, which I don't have.
Really?
It's Windows 7 or Windows XP, either or. And I don't have either one.
That's pretty obscure.
So the only way I figured this out was on some RC group's message board, and Radiolink replied like, "Oh, by the way, you have to use a Windows XP machine."
So what transmitter are you supposed to use with this receiver? Do they have a new transmitter that you're supposed to use with it?
So this is their newest transmitter. It's the AT-10. The weird thing is I got it to work, and it was working great.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful transmitter.
Nice, and it's lightweight, and it actually seemed to work pretty well. When I switched out receivers, I took my Eachine apart. I switched out receivers. I bound it. No, I didn't get any signal, which makes sense because I now know that it doesn't work with this transmitter. So the R12DS does not work with the Radiolink AT-10. I put it back on the old receiver, and nothing works. So it will bind. It will not control my quad, and in Betaflight, it will not get any values from my transmitter.
Okay, so let's take a step backwards for anybody who's following along, because I told you when we were getting started, one of the reasons I picked your question as one of the first ones I wanted to do was because it's a really common question people ask is that they can't get their receiver working right, or that their receiver isn't working, they don't know why, and so I think the troubleshooting process for this will be interesting to people, even if they don't have a radio. So if you're out there watching this and you're like, I don't have a radio link, I don't care. This is going to be useful to you anyway. And the first thing you got to do is you got to get your receiver bound to your transmitter. And what that means is that the receiver and the transmitter are talking to each other. And the reason that we have to do this is that this is not just like an analog signal, like in your car when you tune in on an FM radio station. You just tune into the signal and you pick it up, right? And that's how the old style transmitters, the AM transmitters with the big long whip antenna, you know, the 72 megahertz ones, that's how they worked. Anybody who was on the channel listening, you just made sure that your transmitter and your receiver were on the same frequency and you were good to go. Well, we have the digital transmitters now, and the advantage of those is that we could have 50 of them in the air at once, and we don't have to think about what channel we're on. There's no channels in 2.4 gigahertz control, but the flip side is we have to bind the receiver to the transmitter, and the process for doing that is different for every transmitter. But there's usually you'll put the transmitter into a bind mode, and they'll either push a button on the receiver, or sometimes you'll use a little jumper to jump some pins, and they'll bind, and there will usually be some LED indication that they're bound. So you've got them bound. That's not your problem. What's your indication that they're bound? How do you know they're bound?
Okay, so I double tap on the little button. It goes from red light to blue light, which means it's gone from PPM to S-bus. I hold it down for 2 seconds. It flashes. My transmitter then has that little signal, the little bars at the top of it.
Yeah, the RSSI.
The RSSI signal. It's a full signal, and that to me is how I bound it last time. So it seems like it's bound.
Yeah, and the way that the transmitter and the receiver indicate that they're bound will differ. But some of the ways there's sometimes is like a green LED that you'll see on the receiver, where like with FreeSky receivers, if you see a solid green LED, that means it's bound. If you see a flashing red LED, that means it's lost link or is not bound. Likewise, if you have telemetry, you may see an RSSI or a signal strength readout on the transmitter. That's true for the Radiolink. It's true for for Taranis. There are various ways. There's always going to be some kind of visual indication that the receiver is bound, though. If the receiver didn't have that, then that'd be kind of dumb. So we want to verify that it's bound. You also talked about putting it into PPM or S-bus mode, and this is a topic that's probably going to be too big for me to expound upon in this video, but. Basically, the receiver has various protocols it can output. Way back in the old day when we had a bunch of servos on our fixed wings, it would output PWM, which is pulse width modulation, and that's what you use to talk to a servo. PPM is kind of like PWM, but it's all over one wire. So instead of 8 channels and 8 wires, you have 8 channels and 1 wire, one after the other. And then there's S-bus, which is a serial protocol. It's a digital protocol, ones and zeros. And that's if you're wondering, you want to be using a digital protocol like S-bus, I-bus, or Spectrum. And your receiver is interesting because a lot of times you'll see receivers that'll do either PPM or S-bus, and usually the way it works is there's a different set of pins. One of the pins will output PPM, one will output S-bus, or maybe there's a jumper you use to convert it, but yours has a button you push to convert the mode. So is that right?
That's right. Yeah, you double tap the button. I think it's You hit the hitter twice in under a second, and it'll flip colors.
And there's an LED that indicates you're in S-bus mode, and you're
right.
and you did it. And the nice thing about you is you've done it right once before, so we have some confidence that you know what you're doing.
I did something correct the first time, or I damaged it somehow the second time. So
So let's talk about how you've got it wired up to the Wizard now. The Wizard has an SP Racing F3 flight controller. Where did you connect the signal wire?
Signal wire is connected to UART3.
Okay.
Which after using your CLI settings is enabled for serial bus.
Yeah, and so you've got it hooked up to the RX line on UART3.
Yes.
And you've got it wired, I guess, to the right pin on the receiver. So those are and then the last thing to check would be the Betaflight configuration. So in Betaflight, we would want to look at the ports tab, and we would want to verify that serial RX was turned on, and we would want to look at the configuration tab and verify that we had a serial receiver type and S-bus was the serial receiver provider. And again, I assume because you didn't change any of that stuff when you went from one receiver to the other. So that should still be configured right.
Right. Yeah, it should be the same.
let's take a look at your copter and let's just double check your configuration. It's probably correct since it was working before, but anybody else who's watching will be able to see what the correct setup looks like. So the first place we'll go is into the ports tab. And what we want to see is for UART3, we want to see serial RX enabled and nothing else. And that is indeed what we see. And when I say nothing else, I mean all the other stuff like telemetry, sensor, peripherals, those all say disabled. That's what we want. Of course, the specific UART that any individual person would want to see would depend on their flight controller. Different flight controllers will use different UARTs for the receiver, but in this case, it's UART3, and that's correct. So now we'll go to configuration. And what we want to see is where it says receiver, we want to see serial-based receiver. And where it says serial receiver provider, we want to see SBus. All of that is correct. So that is now when we go to the receiver tab, the next thing we should see is that when you power on your receiver and you power on your copter, we should see it moving. Now let's go ahead and try that. Now before you power up, you're always going to want to make sure your props are off when you do something like this. I always use a smoke stopper also. Anytime I'm not going to fly, I use a smoke stopper. Just one day it's going to catch a short, but definitely at least have your props off. So now
what is a smoke stopper?
So a smoke stopper is it's basically you take an automotive light bulb and you solder it in serial, if you know what that means, on the positive line between two XT60 connectors. And what it does is you plug your battery into the smoke stopper, you plug the smoke stopper into the copter. And then if you've screwed up your soldering and you have a short, for example, then when you plug the battery in, the bulb will act as a current limiting device and prevent you from burning anything out.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically the bulb will pass about 2 to 3 amps at 4S voltage. And that's what'll happen is when you plug it in, the bulb will light up and you'll go, oh crap, I have a problem. You'll quick unplug the battery. And in that short amount of time, 3 amps is not enough to smoke anything. So it protects you from a short. It protects you from if you flash the wrong firmware to your ESC, anything that might burn something out, it'll do a good job of protecting it. And the other thing it does, and this is the unofficial use, is if you have your props on and you've been too lazy to take them off, 3 amps is not enough to really spin the motors very hard. You can just stick your finger in the props at 3 amps and it'll just stop.
Gotcha.
It'll scare the dickens out of you if the motors try to spin, but it can't actually hurt anything. So it is a safe way of leaving your props on when you're working with the copter, although you should probably still take them off. So you plugged in, and now the receiver wasn't working before because the copter does not power the receiver from USB. Some flight controllers do that, and that's great because it means we could do this without plugging the battery in, but yours doesn't. So when you plugged it in, it does look like the values are changed, doesn't it?
Can't believe this. It's now getting signal.
I knew that was going to happen. I
literally just did this last night.
No, I knew it. I knew as I was telling you to plug the battery in. I was like, it's going to work. It's totally going to work.
I cannot believe this is working. Any idea how long I've worked on this?
It's always the way it is, isn't it?
This is unbelievable. I don't know what is going on.
The minute you ask for help, it starts working.
I can't believe this.
So let's think about and we know it's working because here in the receiver tab, as you move, like we can already see that the channels have changed. Go ahead and unplug your battery real quick. Watch what happens to the channels. You probably know this, but we'll show all the viewers. When you unplug the battery, what's going to happen is that the flight controller is going to go into failsafe. Right now, the receiver is gone. The flight controller is powered from USB and it's gone into failsafe. And what it does there is it locks all the channels to center and sets the throttle to 0. And if you've set any other failsafe options, it'll do that too. But basically, everything locks out. So then when you plug the battery back in, it'll come back. The flight controller will go out of failsafe, and we'll see these channel values change to whatever the sticks are sending. On a side note, I can't help but notice that you notice your channels aren't centered.
Yes. So like auxiliary to 8 is like 1547, and that's just getting it to. I don't care. I haven't done that to fixing that yet because it hasn't been showing up.
Yeah, I don't care so much about the aux channels, but definitely the 4 main control channels, roll, pitch, yaw, and throttle. Definitely want them trim to 1500 at the center, and with the endpoints 1000 to 2000. And the reason why that's important, of course, is if we look at the 3D model on the right hand side, you can see it's kind of drifting, and that's what your real copter is going to be trying to do while you're flying. So yeah.
So should I be trimming this actually in the transmitter now, or is this like a CLI command?
No, you trim it in the transmitter. If you have a transmitter that, like, for some reason you can't adjust the trims and the endpoints, there are CLI commands that let you change the endpoints, but it's better to do it in the transmitter. So what you're going to want to do is in the transmitter, and if you hold up the transmitter, we can take a look at it. Somewhere in there's going to be a screen where we can adjust the endpoints and the trims are easy. So the trims, of course, you can do with the switches next to the gimbals, but ideally what you want to use is what's called sub trims. And the difference is that sub trims are stored permanently. They basically move the center point permanently. Yeah, and you can see right there on the menu, endpoint and sub trim.
Right. So they have trim and sub trim and endpoint.
Yeah. So here's it. Go ahead and set it down. I don't want to make you hold it up, but the difference between trim and sub trim is this. So trims are those little switches to the side of your gimbals. And the idea with those is, think about flying a fixed wing. So you're flying a fixed wing and it's rolling a little bit to the left. So you just reach your thumb down and you bump the trim a little bit to the right, and that trims it out, right? But next time you're flying, maybe the weight distribution's a little different, or the balance is different, or the aileron's gotten bumped, and now you need a little more or a little less left trim, right? The idea with the trims is that it's something you can kind of tweak and adjust in real time while you're flying as the flight conditions demand it. And for quadcopters, we have a flight controller that does all that nonsense. So we want our channels centered and then left alone. What sub trims is, it is a sort of it's like a secondary trim, and it moves the center point of the channel. It makes the new 0 point for the channel be whatever the sub trim says it is. So what we want to use with quadcopters is we're going to use the sub trims, and then we're going to leave the trims centered. And the idea is that you always know that your trims should be centered at 0, and that's when your channels will be centered. And then you use the sub trims to actually adjust the center point. I hope that made sense. It's a little confusing. Why are there 2 trims? We really only want 1 trim. Sub trims is the trim you set and then you never think about again. Trims is kind of a thing where you might be tweaking it. You're not always going to be in the same place.
Okay.
So you would want to, and we don't have to do it now, but you would want to adjust your sub trims to get the center of the channels at 1500, and you only have to do that for roll, pitch, yaw, and throttle. And then you're going to hold the stick at full deflection and adjust your endpoints so they go from 1000 and then 2000 at the top.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep, definitely. And the nice thing is that if you have an S-Bus receiver, my experience has been that then once you set it once, they're all the same. You can use the same sub trims and endpoints for every one. In fact, I don't even make a second model for all my copters. I have all my copters on one model. I just bind all the receivers to the same model. I don't know if Radiolink can do that, but if it can. And then I set all the copters up with the same arming modes and everything. So basically, I just have one model for all my copters.
Nice. Okay.
So let's try and figure out why this wasn't working. So get in there with your finger and kind of poke and wiggle. Maybe there's a bad connection. I don't know. Poke the transmitter, not the transmitter, wiggle the receiver, jiggle the wires, poke at them, prod them, and let's watch the receiver tab. That's what we're looking at right now on the broadcast. Let's watch it, and when we see it go into failsafe, we'll know that something didn't go right, or if we see any of the channels glitch.
I surprisingly had 2 bad servo cables, and it took me a long time to figure it out. It took me buying a 3rd servo cable just in case.
Yeah,
and that told me that my first 2 were bad. So
yeah, I'm not. And you haven't changed anything since the last time it didn't work, right?
I literally worked on this last night, and I powered this on, and I don't know if maybe I bumped it, or I don't know. I'm playing with the.
Yeah. Nothing's changing. It's all solid.
All the connections are good.
Yeah.
It's in S-Bus mode. It's in purple LED.
Yeah. Well, great. I'm glad I could help.
I think it's just your presence.
Yeah, no, I do this. I do various kinds of troubleshooting for a living, and that's always how it is. As soon as you show up, it stops working.
Right.
But so here's what I think, though. I mean, I would still appreciate the opportunity to do the call because I think some good education. I hope it's educational for some people out there. Maybe you already knew all this, but that it really has to be either a physical connection or maybe a problem with the receiver, because your configuration didn't change, right? So the fact that you had it working before and it suddenly stopped working tells us that the configuration is probably correct. You changed the receiver, you changed it back. That's a place where a physical connection could have gotten screwed up. Probably the receiver's not broken because the receiver wasn't broken before. We can't really rule anything out because you never know. Anytime you handle something, it could break spontaneously and weird stuff happens. But I don't know.
I think flipping the servo cable, if I were to have hooked it up to a receiver backwards, like flipped, would that have like fried a receiver or caused damage?
No, in fact, they do a really clever thing with the servo cables. They thought of that. They thought of the fact that people were going to do that. In fact, some servo cables are keyed. They have a little bit of a tab sticking out. They only go in one way. I forget who makes them that way. But many of them are not keyed. And what they do is that the wiring is, the center wire is 5 volts. And the outer wires are ground and signal, right? So if you flip it over and put it in backwards, 5 volts is in the right place, right? And ground is not connected.
So it's dead. It doesn't do anything.
Yeah, exactly. And signal is connected to ground. But the key is that because 5 volts is in the center, 5 volts never goes where 5 volts shouldn't go, and nothing gets damaged. So you can't damage anything by plugging a servo cable in backwards.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
Cool.
Well, as soon as we hang up, it'll stop working again. But if it does stop working again, you can be reasonably sure it's a physical connection because we know the radio's bound. We know that Betaflight's configured correctly. And at this point, either it's a bad solder joint, a bad wire, or you haven't soldered it, right? You're plugged in with a servo cable. Yeah, so it's probably a bad physical connection or possibly a damaged receiver. But I'm going to go with bad physical connection.
And because I had bought another receiver, I bought a receiver that didn't function with my transmitter. So Radiolink wasn't very clear that their newest receiver doesn't work with their newest transmitter, and that's not clear. And I had to go to a messaging board to figure that out. So
anybody else there? So again, for the people out there who do have, and that's a really good looking transmitter. I'm digging that transmitter.
It's light. It's nice. It seems I'm happy with it while it works.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So for people who have the Radiolink transmitter, what's the receiver that you've got that doesn't work?
The R12DS does not work with the Radiolink AT-10. So the reason why is because this firmware is not correct. It has to be upgraded, which it can be, but it has to be upgraded via a Windows 7 or a Windows XP machine, which I don't have.
Yeah, no, not many people do. Anybody who did have one of those machines got hit by this ransomware worm this week, right? Got taken out.
That's right. So they probably don't have a machine either.
Yeah, nobody. What's up, Radiolink? Give me a break.
Yeah. So the R10DS and the R6 DSM receivers work great with the AT10. So
okay,
just FYI.
All right. Well, Daniel, thank you for coming out. I'm glad I could help.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate it. I have been struggling with this, and just you calling me was the magic key to get this thing to work. I can't even believe you have no idea how much time I've been trying to troubleshoot this.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I like to tell my customers in my professional life that I get paid for showing up, and doesn't matter if I did anything. I'm just glad it's working. All right.